So I've just been struggling for about the last 2 hours to get the engine onto the gearbox. It's very difficult trying to do this by yourself. It's very hot work. My gloves are literally full of sweat. Lifted my arm up and water poured out just from fighting with this thing. But I've got the engine strapped. It's a bit awkward to hold it, actually. I've got 3 different straps on there holding it up, and one of the problems is holding it level. So if you wrap the straps around the engine mounts, because they're forward of the center line of the engine tips backwards. So I've had to use the jack underneath the back of the gearbox, or the back of the engine rather, to sort of lift it up, but still be able to roll backwards and forwards to get the engine to mount up. And one of the problems is getting everything lined up. So I've used these 8mm steel bars through the holes just to help give me a rough guide that everything's in the right place. And you can see how difficult this is. The spline is in here. When the gearbox is back, you can't see if the spline is engaging or not. The end of the first motion shaft has a little step on it, so you can kind of feel when it goes onto that step and you know you're close. And then I just couldn't get it to engage. I was messing around with it, trying to get it all to work, and eventually I figured out what was wrong and what was holding me up. And the problem is, at the point where the splines just start engaging, these guide rods are just starting to engage with the release bearing cup. And you have to line this up so it's in these slots so it can move backwards and forwards but not rotate. And what I found was, as I was trying to push the engine backwards, the back lip of this cup was hitting the front of these pins. So it was just binding up on that. So once I figured that out, I was able to sort of pull the engine forwards a little bit. So the weight of it was trying to swing it forwards, and then I was able to push it back to line this up on those pins. And then once it was engaged on those pins, it wasn't too bad. I was actually able to push the engine back, and I actually ended up taking the handbrake off and rolling the car forwards onto the engine. And that seemed to work. And now you can see how little room there is inside here. And how, maybe, can I tilt this down? Yeah, it's a bit hard to see, but how down inside there, you can just sort of see, on these arms there's 2 pins, one there and one there, and they engage with a slot, well, they should. They should engage with a slot either side of that. And this is why you cannot separate the engine from the gearbox if you don't undo this bar first, because all that'll happen is you'll pull back and it'll catch on this. So yeah, that's a real bugger. You can also see Mr. Tweed, Alan, has done a video recently, last night, I was watching it, talking about his Riley trials and tribulations and how he made a gauge so that you can find top dead center on the number 1 cylinder so you can time the thing. And you can plainly see the reason here. So, whoops, this is the back of the clutch. The flywheel is inside there. There's no inspection hatches or anything. There's no way you can see that timing mark. I've actually made a timing mark on my flywheel. So I think if I was to turn this over, I may just see the end of the mark there. In which case what I can do is then find top dead center using Mr. Tweed's method with a dial indicator looking for on number 1 piston, and I should be able to make a mark on here, I hope. And that should line up with my mark across the flywheel and clutch, which I'd already made at the number 1 position. This is the first time I've actually been able to see if that is going to be visible there. So hopefully I can do something there, because that's going to make things a lot easier. And it also points out the other problem he mentioned is there's no way to turn this engine over. So you can't get to the flywheel to turn it over. Because I have it on the ground at the moment, of course, I could put it into gear and roll it forwards and backwards and get the engine to turn that way. The dynamo bolts on the front there, and you can see the sort of slotted nut that the dynamo drive engages with. And so the back of the dynamo bolts on there, and the back of it, there is provision inside there for a starting handle. And that's the only way you can actually turn the engine around without moving the entire car. There's just no other way to do it. There's no fan belts or anything you can get to. So I'm glad that's done. It's a bit nerve-wracking kind of doing it by yourself. I made sure the engine was well strapped, and made sure I was never underneath it in case it came down, and I always had the jack under it anyway. But I'm glad that's in place now. The other problem I discovered is with my little engine lifting girder, which is quite big. I mean, it's quite wide. The problem with that is if you're by yourself, you can't push it forwards evenly. So you need two people to push each side. So what I had to do is push one side around a little bit, put the brake on, push the other side around, and just sort of walk it forwards. But once it was close, there's enough swing on the chain, because it's quite a tall chain, that I was able to position things where I needed them. So that's good. It's actually really neat seeing it all in place like that. I will just lower it down and put the bolts for the engine mounts in place, which are those there, and see if it all sets up, and then I may try rolling it backwards and forwards and see if the engine turns over when I roll the car. It's been quite a long day, and I've just finished mostly cleaning up, getting everything in from outside. It's actually getting dark now, starting to get dark, but some success. The engine is in and it all fits. I've set the carburetors on the studs. I haven't actually bolted them on. I have to bolt the manifold on first and then take all the carbs off, bolt the manifold on, and then put the carbs back on the manifold because the bolts are inside here, which is a bit of a pain, but that's not even actually sitting completely flat because it's not bolted in place. But you can see there is enough clearance there around the choke lever, including when it gets actuated. This will be, silly flies. This will be where the shaft goes through that operates the throttle lever. I have the gearbox bolted to the engine now, and I discovered my clutch linkage wasn't going to work. It was completely wrong. Basically, it took so much force to push the clutch, and I could barely do it. So that needed some rethinking, and I've ended up with the same sort of idea, just modified slightly. So what I've done is I rejigged the top arm. I also shortened the pivot point on the lower arm, and I made this sort of cranked arm that's a lot longer, and that now gives me a clutch that feels a lot better, so I can actually operate it by hand. It's a bit painful when there's no pad on the end. That'll make it easier. So that gives me a decent light enough feel. The only problem, of course, is extra leverage here means extra movement on the pedal. And it looks like the pedal's really far down at the moment, but there's so much wear and lost motion in the whole system that you've basically got that much movement before things actually start getting to where they need to be. So you can see possibly the release bearing just coming off there So the clutch rest position will be somewhere like that, possibly further back. So it's all adjustable, and I still don't know how far back I need to go to actually disengage the clutch. So at the moment there, I've got 1/4 of an inch of movement, something like that. And I don't know how much you need. And the other thing I had to do was, it's not sitting very straight at the moment because this bar needs to be bent, but I've actually cranked this so it comes right in close to the gearbox, and I'll use a bent shaft here to transfer the motion up. And that gets it further away, so there's actually room for your foot there now, and this doesn't get in the way. That works a lot better. Whoops, if we can see it. So threaded rod isn't quite strong enough. This was bent the right way, but it keeps twisting around because none of these things are loose. So I did have it bent correctly, and there is enough clearance there. What I might do is get hold of some bar, whatever that diameter is, just square bar, and heat it and bend it to give me the right shape, and then just mill the slots in the end. Basically similar to how the brake rod is. So that's getting there. I guess the way I can test the clutch is take all the spark plugs out and turn it over on the starter. The other thing I have to remember is when I was putting in the circlips for the little fingers that operate the release bearing, I kept thinking to myself, don't drop the split pin, don't drop the split pin. And of course I dropped the split pin. So that's floating around in the bottom there somewhere, so I need a magnet just to fish that out. But I should be able to turn it over on the starter without the plugs in, just enough to see if the clutch is disengaging and figure out where that point is. Other than that, it's looking pretty good, I think. One last thing, I thought, just for fun, let's try putting the dynamo on and see if that fits. And amazingly, it does. Only I've realized I've got the back plate on it in the wrong position. Basically, I think this electrical outlet should be up here, and this little hole, which I think is a drain hole, should be on the bottom. So that's not a hard job to undo those screws and rotate that round, but yeah, that looks good. And again, you get to see just how little clearance there is on these cars. So that's between the axle and the dynamo. There's not a lot. So, but that's how they were. Also see here the oil filter sits down out of the way. The brake string is completely out of the way of everything and clearing. And the body line should go somewhere up here, so it will clear the handbrake lever. And hopefully somebody noticed my totally deliberate mistake of putting that little arm on the wrong way around. That's now the correct way. And you can also see, this was the mark I made on the flywheel, the timing mark. So you can actually see that through this little inspection cover, which is good.